I've long held the view that the world would be a much friendlier place if we all drove around in cute cars. That's a small part of why I own a Mini. But back in the early 90s, with cash virtually flowing out of their ears, Nissan made a run of micro-based retros, the likes of which we've never really seen again. So today on TwinCam, the most popular of the four famous Pike cars, the sweetness that is the Figaro. Before we get into it, this car is to be auctioned by Manor Park Classics. So if you know who lives at 13 Bannerman Road, then please do follow the link in the description. But rather against Nissan's will, the Figaro became really quite popular here in Great Britain. So before going anywhere else, we're going to need a bit of a history lesson. Through the 70s and 80s, the land of the rising sun surfaced from its post-war rebuilding, Japan finding itself a mecca for consumer electronics as its car industry followed the motorcycles in taking over the West. Its industry could do no wrong, and with financial might came speculation and a boom in asset prices. As I said, money was coming out of their ears, and in this economy, Japanese cars began to change. For those of you who didn't grow up pouring through the dealerships of Gran Turismo 4, I'll let you off for not quite perceiving the sheer decadence on offer. Long-running sports cars like the Nissan Fairlady and Mazda RX-7 shifted their focus. Nissan's S130, Z31 and Z32 had a grand touring focus that the old S30 did not. The FB Mazda RX-7 was a mid-range sports car with as little as 100 brake horsepower. But come the FD in the early 90s, the RX-7 was now a style-forward, almost concept-looking thoroughbred with two turbochargers and eventually that classic JDM understatement of a quoted 276 brake horsepower. When Nissan brought back the Skyline GTR in 1989, it too had twin turbos plus four-wheel drive before becoming Godzilla. From evolution to revolution, Mazda created an all-new platform specifically for the MX-5. Honda went Ferrari hunting with the NSX, the Toyota Celsior, or Lexus LS, stuck two fingers up at the Mercedes S-Class, and all was very rosy indeed. Decadence is the word best used as the Japanese car industry was rather enjoying itself. In 1982, however, Nissan were not exactly facing in that direction. That's the year they launched their new Super Mini, the Micra, or March as it was known at home. And as you'd expect, it was boxy, contemporary, successful, but largely forgettable. Back in the K10's design stage, however, the seeds were sown for what later became the Pike cars, named to symbolise the spearheading of a new design direction. You see, Nissan had four design proposals: A, B1, B2 and C. It's the latter that was finally chosen, but B1 entirely bucked the trends of its day. The cutesy, round headlamped, somewhat mini-looking proposal went down well in the clinics, and though deemed too much of a risk to become the Micra itself, it clearly left an impression. In fact, B1 wasn't dreamt up by a car designer at all, rather a chap Nissan had invited along, then fashion designer Naoki Sakai. He was an outsider, and at the time he didn't actually hold a driver's license. Later delving into industrial design, Sakai is a retrofuturist, viewing car design as less a progression and more along the lines of fashion, ebbing and flowing back and forth through the decades. And after the K10's launch, Nissan perceived a gap in Japanese society, one that wound up quietly filled by, of all companies, Rover. Every nation has its own relationship with consumerism. If you live in the UK, then I'm sure you're aware that second-hand cars tend to be worth a little bit more on the continent than they are here. And that's because Britons quite like the idea of having a brand new car. The Japanese are also like this, but multiply it by 10. In the late 1980s, therefore, people who liked the idea of owning a classic car realised that Rover still built Minis. And it wasn't long before the Japanese were buying more of them than the British were. In the years before this happened, however, Nissan recognised the appreciation people would have for Sakai's postmodernism. And you can cross off Edward mentions the Mini on your twin cam bingo cards. With general Japanese consumerism ramped up to extreme levels, individualism and fashion larger factors than ever before, Sakai was tasked with creating 3 concepts for the 1987 Tokyo Motor Show. This was the start of the Pike Factory, not a physical production plant, but rather an internal Nissan design team, whose job it was to create these sweeties. Taking its bow first, available to the public shortly after the show, was the newly christened Nissan B1, limited to just 10,000 examples. Almost immediately, however, Nissan were inundated by interest, eventually running a lottery to allocate reservations. 2 years after its concept's debut, the production version of the Nissan POW had over 51,000 applications, and on a first-come, first-served basis, just over 31,000 were built between 1989 and 1991. I must admit, this is my favourite of the Pike cars, what with its rippled panels, little roof rails, flip-up windows and 2-piece tailgate. More practical, the POW certainly is, but it's not as practical as the S-Cargo, a tiny delivery van so named because, well, it looks like a snail. In the same time span, around 10,000 of these are believed to have been built, and how on earth could you not fall in love? With our triplets now all in the world and the bubble economy still in flow, the Pike Factory created a 4th car, to be shown at the Tokyo show in '89, and we finally meet the Nissan Figaro. Our friend here is the most luxurious of the Pike cars, and every example was produced during 1991, though again, they rather underestimated demand. The plan was to build 8,000, but another lottery took place and 20,073 were eventually built, many of which found their way to Britain. When new, however, they were only sold in Japan, and specifically, they were distributed through Nissan's Cherry stores. For a long time, many Japanese manufacturers segregated sales of their cars, and they did this because they rather had to. In Europe, manufacturers tend to only build a certain type of car, but in Japan, they don't adhere to this. Toyota, for example, builds both the Pixis range of K-cars and the Century Luxury Saloon. Selling these on the same forecourt wouldn't do either much good, so traditionally, the former is sold through either their Nets or Corolla stores, and the latter in the main Toyota store. If you've ever seen an original Mazda MX-5 imported from Japan, you'll have noticed that it's badged as a Yunos Roadster, and that's an extension of this segregation up to a brand level, leading to the creation of Lexus and Infiniti to do the same thing for export markets. Back in the 80s and 90s, however, all the Pike cars were sold through Nissan's Cherry stores, while a Z-Car or Cedric would have been found at a Nissan Blue Stage store. But I digress, because left to my own devices, we'd be here all day. So back to somewhere near the topic, and our first port of call is, of course, the style. Like the B1, the Figaro is a 2-door saloon, but unlike its siblings, it's a fixed profile convertible. So while the pillars all stay in place, the centre section and the rear window fold down into this plastic lined space back here. Very cool though that may be, it does rather restrict the boot space. I mean, honestly, it might as well not have one. And there isn't so much room in the back either, so K9 definitely is not coming with us. What that tells us, therefore, is that this is not exactly a usable town car, it's more of a fashion accessory. But that is exactly how Nissan wanted us to view it. I mentioned earlier that Sakai viewed car design in the same vein as fashion, So the Figaro's design is rooted in individualism. It's entirely unapologetic for its lack of practicality, but it brims with personality. Further to that, and while the B1 is a mixture of 60s and 80s style, and the POW is rooted in the 50s, the Figaro is Art Deco. Sure, we can find bits of the 60s Datsun Fairladies in the overall silhouette, but the timelessness of this particular car comes from its overall simplicity. It's in the details that its Art Deco nature shines through, and in physically experiencing the car, the details lay forth immense appreciation. Inside and out, there is no clue that this car was based on a Micra. In fact, the perception is deepened by the Nissan name appearing only twice, very small, once on the bonnet badge and the other on the boot. Inside, there are no nasty grey plastics or modern pictograms. Instead, every switch is metal, shaped as petals, engineered not to be cheap, but to feel special. Where there's the space on the heater, each function is spelled out and engraved into the panel. Remember that this is 1991, and every Figaro came with air conditioning and a specially designed Clarion stereo with both a cassette and CD player. I've been using the word decadence in reference to this era, and to the Pike cars in general, but while they're small and could easily appear affordable, it's abundantly clear that the Figaro was designed to be premium. Hold that thought, as we'll be back to it. For now, there's still more to discuss, and the sheer consideration the design team had for the character of this car is no clearer than with the colours. The Figaro was available in 4 pastels, each of which symbolises a season. This car is lapis grey, the most numerous, with over 8,000 examples, and this is winter. Next is emerald green for spring, and around 5,500 were painted like Sarah Jane's. There were just under 4,000 Figaros finished for summer in pale aqua, while the rest, over 2,000, were topaz mist for autumn. As will probably not surprise you, Nissan barely made a penny on these cars. As I'm sure is true with its siblings, people are always going to pick away at the surface and try to figure out exactly what it looks like. There's certainly a chunk of Fairlady, and who am I to argue against it having some Renault Dauphine in the profile and Auto Bianchi Bianchina in its face. But the brilliance of the Figaro is that it looks unashamedly retro, without devolving into a tribute act. In that regard, the Figaro is the best resolved of all the Pike cars, and while Sakai led the team, it's believed that this car can be more fairly attributed to a Nissan stylist named Shoji Takahashi. It's also been said that a serious proportion of the team were women, even more unusual then than it is today, and I think that consideration, as I've already mentioned, is why the Figaro's design is so widely adored. But back to our earlier thought and the clarity of the Figaro as a premium, fashion-forward small car. While other Pike cars were available with automatic transmissions, both the S-Cargo, weirdly, and the Figaro were only available with 3-speed slush boxes. Of course, there's the convertible top and all the other equipment that came with this car, but as we'd know it in Great Britain, the engine is what really differs this from a K10 Micra. Beneath the forward-hinging bonnet, because cool as well as impractical, as is becoming a theme, is indeed the same overhead cam MA engine as a regular March. Only unlike the B1 and POW, with their 50 horsepower carb-fed MA10s, the Figaro features an MA10 ET, meaning its 987 cc's are augmented by multi-point fuel injection and a little tiny turbocharger, which really does make whooshy noises. This engine is lifted from the March Turbo, a car we didn't get here in Britain, But if you're keen on your JDM heroes, then it's a slightly larger and honk-free version of the MA09 ERT from the March Super Turbo. None of the Pike cars are particularly quick, but unlike its siblings, the Figaro has a bit of gravity about it. The strengthening required by the convertible top, plus the mass of the air conditioning, comfy leather seats, etc., raises this car up to 140 kilograms beyond the B1, weighing in at 810 kilograms. Never mind the gearbox slurping all the power away, that's why it needs 76 brake horsepower and 78 pounds-feet of torque. That's not at all a bad output for the era, even if the S-Cargo gets vaguely the same figures out of a naturally aspirated 1.5 litre E-Series from Nissan's Cherry and Sunny. It would certainly have been less complicated to fit that engine to the Figaro, but you know, bubble economy. Keeping us on the road, however, is exactly what we'd find in a British-delivered K10. Struts up front and a solid coil-sprung rear beam, with a panhard rod and a couple of longitudinal links. All thoroughly conventional and absolutely adequate. But you know what? I just don't care. And I'm sure you don't either. The Figaro just isn't the kind of car where its underlying engineering really matters. What's much more interesting, at least to me, is people's reactions to the Pike cars. As we all know, there are some rather insecure human beings out there who'll do whatever it takes to convince people otherwise. They'll already have outed themselves in the comments, but that doesn't stop me theorising as to why cars are not as cute as they once were. The folks who do own cars to make a point about themselves have an animalistic need to look aggressive and therefore dominant, while some more rounded members of society may choose a Pike car because they're friendly and approachable. And while I wouldn't personally have a Figaro, I definitely own a POW, though my Mini makes both me and other people smile quite enough. I'd assume that this car's personalised brand of small car fashion and luxury is why it gradually became so popular here in Great Britain. I mean, just look at the accessories brochure. It's mind-boggling. There are probably more of them here than there are in Japan nowadays, but that speaks of just how successful the entire package is. Naoki Sakai's work has always centred around retrofuturism, and that factor is why I appreciate the Pike cars even more than the R50 Mini, or Fiat 500 or new Renault 5. Even in period, the Nissan Figaro did not compromise to meet the standards of its day. It's entirely its own thing. But as design critic Phil Patton once said, the Pike cars are unabashedly retro. They're promiscuous and are the height of postmodernism. So rather than acting as tributes, these friendly faces preceded a whole generation of curvy 90s cars, including no less than the second generation Micra, the K11, launched in 1992. Yet with the Figaro's relative commonality, at least compared to its siblings here in Great Britain, we're in danger of it falling into cliché territory. Everybody knows what these cars are, and that somewhat kills the illusion. Plus, the simple fact of its timelessness causes people to forget that they were built closer to the period they're referencing than they were to today. The Figaro is no longer a car that can just be driven every day by a non-enthusiast, and that is a real shame. But what it says to me is that we're due another shot. From a fashion perspective, rarity breeds desirability, but wouldn't the world be so much nicer a place if this kind of car was on every street corner? And with that, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then please do click like and subscribe to TwinCam as well. I'm forever indebted to my wonderful Patreon supporters, so if you'd like to support me that way, then please do follow the link in the description. And I'll have more videos coming along soon.